him, because if I couldn't get finance from anywhere else, I was going to have to ask him. Though, that would be my last resort. Luke, shouldn't you be out somewhere snorting cocaine off a supermodel's arse? Luke was 23. His second album was a massive success. He had toured constantly for 3 years, but was now in a hiatus of sorts. He lived in a big Georgian terrace house on Waterloo Road, bought for cash 2 years after he dropped out of college to sing in a band. We, on the other hand, were renting a one-bedroom mews nearby with no central heating and unreliable plumbing. We were mystified by Luke's stardom. Luke looked waifish with his big eyes and long hair and a thin, reedy voice which would have travelled nowhere without amplification. Brian and I were jealous. We were older and we had worked to pay our way through college, earning respectable enough 2-1 arts degrees. Luke had surprised us all by getting the results to study engineering, but then spent his 2 years smoking hash by the pond, reading poetry and rehearsing with the Wombstones. At one stage he attached a collar to a hen and walked it through the campus. All for affectation. We never knew where he got the hen or where it ended up afterwards. For some unquantifiable reason, he could attract women. I don't understand how. Women are weird. He could take or leave them and never seemed to be particularly attached to any of them. It got to the stage where I didn't bother trying to remember their names anymore because there'd be a new one along any minute. When he got famous as a solo act, Luco, he was generous, bringing us all out to join him on tour in London and Lisbon, splashing cash around like it was nothing to him. His name had opened doors for me in the arts scene, but that spring there had been no tour invites, no lavish award ceremonies, no rock and roll parties. He'd just turn up at our house in time for dinner, at least twice a week. That was always the thing about Luke. He couldn't take a hint. He'd sit on our sofa staring at the television, though not appearing to take in whatever programme was on. He'd eat the dinner that Susan or I prepared, ignore our baby, and as soon as he was fed, he'd leave without much of a thank you. Eventually I brought up the subject of finance and my funding difficulties, and he nodded and grunted. No offer was forthcoming. I was forced to ask. It wouldn't be a lend as such, I said. It would be an investment, and we'd be asking him to compose the music for our film, even though Luke still couldn't read music and we didn't actually have a film yet because we had no funding. It's not really my thing, he said. Did you ask Brian? Brian at this stage was living in Paris. Mum would get an occasional letter from him written on a page torn out of a copybook. If Brian couldn't afford writing paper, he certainly couldn't afford to lend me money. Brian? What are you talking about? You know what he's like with money, and I don't think he's even earning that much. I tried to contain my frustration. It was so typical of Luke to be completely unaware and unconcerned. He shrugged and picked up the remote control and changed the TV channel without making eye contact. Susan got up and left the table in disgust. It took a few weeks after that for me to tell him he was no longer welcome. If I'd done it straight away, he'd have thought it was about the money. And it was about the money, but it was everything else too. He didn't appear to be washing too often. He brought literally nothing to our table, and he sucked the energy out of our home as soon as he entered it. I didn't see him for the rest of that year, though I read in the papers that he was back in the studio recording another album and was then going on tour. I saw this in the Sunday Gossip column. I wasn't about to pick up the phone. Susan wanted that Christmas to be special, but she felt guiltier about Luke than I did. She suggested I invite everyone over for Christmas dinner, and then it would look like he was naturally included. Besides, we wanted to avoid going to Mum's house in Glenageary because she was always much louder and overbearing in her own home than in ours. Brian was home from Paris for a few days and was going to stay with Mum. It was Daisy's first Christmas. We had finally won a small film-based grant and things were looking good for us. We were going into production in January for our first short film, Fear of Life, and I was planning to announce it over our festive lunch. I rang Luke and left a message on his answering machine. When he hadn't rung back after a few days, Susan dropped a note in his letterbox. He never showed up. We didn't think much of it. It had happened before that he would drop off the radar for a month or two. We knew from Brian that the tour was on a break and that Luke was home in Dublin. Mum was put out that he hadn't called her. She sulked about it, but it was obvious that she hadn't tried to contact him either. The family were impressed by my news, at first. Mum raised her glass and toasted me. My son, the next Steven Spielberg. But then when Brian heard it was a short film and that it wasn't going to get a cinema release, he was dismissive. What's the point in making a film that nobody's going to see? He asked me.